In this video, we will wrap the series by creating the final features of the Habit Tracker app. We will create a dialog box that will allow us to add and update habits, as well as the ability to delete them. Let's start by installing the Headless UI package for Vue. I want this dialog to be controlled by the habit store. Let's start by adding a new state called isDialogOpen and set it to false. Now add a couple of actions to control the dialog. Start with Open Dialog, and this will just set the state value to true. Next is Close Dialog, which sets the state value to false. Expose the new state and actions down here. Now I'm fully aware that I'm breaking the first rule of TDD because I'm writing the code first without any test. But I'm doing this for a good reason. In an ideal world, you will always start with a test and then you write the code you need based on that test. But in the real world, this is not always the case. Maybe you need to write the code fast because of time constraints, or you are working on someone else's code without any tests. Whatever the case, you can always go back and add the tests later. This is completely acceptable and it is an important skill to develop. So for the remainder of this video, I will write the code first and then at the end, I'll go back to add the missing tests. Okay, moving on. Create a new component called habitDialog.view. I'll start by importing a few components from the Headless UI package. I'll use transitions to animate the dialog display. So import transition root and transition child. After that, we need dialog, dialog panel, and dialog title. All of these from Headless UI/Vue. We also need the habit store, so import and use it like this. Let's start by adding a transition root component. This is controlled by the isDialogOpen state. Inside, we add a dialog component. The close event will call the close dialog action. This fires if the user clicks outside the dialog or hits the escape key. Next, create a div for the backdrop. And to animate this backdrop, we wrap it inside a transition child component. The enter animation will take 300 milliseconds with an ease out curve. It starts at 0% opacity and ends at 100%. And for the exit animation, we do the opposite. And it takes 200 milliseconds with an ease in curve. Let's add a couple of divs to hold the entire dialog. Now we need another transition component to animate the dialog. The enter animation will take 300 milliseconds with an ease out curve. Starts at 0 opacity and 95% scale. Ends at 100% opacity and 100% scale. The exit animation takes 200 milliseconds with an ease in curve, starting at 100% opacity and 100% scale, ending at 0 opacity and 95% scale. Inside, we have a dialog panel component with a few classes to make it look pretty. We add a dialog title component. And for now, let's just set the title as New Habit. Next, we need a div for the dialog content. Let's add another one for the Save button. Clicking this will close the dialog. In order to actually use this new dialog, let's take this button, which is currently sitting in the blade template, and turn it into its own component. Create a new component called newHabitButton.view. This will also use the habit store. Take the button from the blade template and put it here. Clicking this button will open the dialog. Open the app.js file and import the habit dialog and new habit button components. Go back to the blade template, replace the button with a new component, and let's put the dialog down here. Start a new vdev server if you don't have one already, and let's give this a try. Great, we have a working dialog now, but it's off to the side. We want this centered. So let's fix that. Go back to the habit dialog, and in this div, the one before the second transition child, add justify center. Alright, that's better. Now let's add the form fields to create a new habit. First thing to do is to install the official Forms plugin from Tailwind. This provides basic resets for form styles that makes the form elements easy to override with Tailwind classes. Next, add the plugin to tailwind.config.js. Now open the habit dialog component, add a div, and then a label for the habit name. Add a few classes to make it look pretty. Then add a text input called name. Give it a bit of top margin. Make it block with full width, rounded corners, and gray border. A small shadow to make it stand out. Let's see how this looks. It looks good, but I don't like this blue ring when the field is in focus. Let's fix it by giving it a border color when in focus. Perfect. And just to give you an idea of what the form plugin does, if you remove it from the list, this is how the form looks, which is not good. Okay, let's add it back, and much better. Let's add another input for the times per day. I'll just copy and paste this one. And they are a bit too close together. So let's add a bit of top margin here. And okay, that's better. Now we need a couple of placeholders for the validation errors. Add a span here with a red small text. I'll type in the error message, but this will later be replaced with the actual message from the response. Copy this and paste it down here. Change the error message. Okay, that looks good. In the last episode, we already tested the ability to create habits, so all I have to do is use it. I'll create a couple of state variables in the habits store to keep track of validation errors and the form data we need to send in the payload. Next, let's create a new action called store habit and make it async. Create a try-catch block, and here we make a post request to API habits, sending the form data in the payload. If nothing goes wrong, we can clear out any previous validation errors, which is supposed to be an object and not an array. Clear the form data and set the habits to the updated list we got in the response. Also, at this point, we can close the dialog. In case of an error, first we examine the response status, and if we got a status of 422, this means validation errors. So grab the validation errors from the response and store them like this. Let's expose the new action in state variables. Oops, this is a comma, not a dot. Go back to the habits dialog component. Let's add a variable called loading and set it to false. This is so we can give a visual indication that we are processing the request. Let's go back up here and change a few things. Set the v model for the name input to habits form data name. Let's also add a condition to the error message placeholder and show it only when we have an error for the name. And also replace the text with the actual error message like this. And let's do the same for times per day. In the button, first, let's disable it if we are currently loading the request. Let's wrap this text in a span and show it only if we are not loading. Finally, add this SVG code to create a spinner. I'll leave a link in the description to the GitHub gist so you can copy and paste this code. And let's show this only if we are loading. Finally, change the button click event to store habit. We will create this method next. And this is just store habit, not habits.storeHabit. Let's go back down here and create the store habit method. All we need to do here is set the loading to true and then wait for the results of habits store habit. Once that's done, set loading to false. If we try this out now without any data, we get the error messages for each field. Let's fill this with a test habit. Let's call it take a 5-minute break and times per day equal to 10. Once we press save, the dialog closes and we have the new task here. Excellent. Now let's update the task with a new execution every time we press the +1 button. We're going to need a new test for this. If we had more interactions with executions, I would probably recommend creating a new test file. But for this scenario, I'll just add a new test inside the habit test.php file. Let's call it test habits executions can be created. Create a new habit like this. Now make a post JSON request to API habits habit ID execution. All we need to do now is assert that the number of executions for the habit is exactly 1. Okay, let's create a new route. Now let's add the new method to the controller. And finally, we just need to call executions create. And we're back to green. Now go back to the habits store, and to make use of this new route, all we need to do is call it from the new execution action right here. We don't want to make this asynchronous because we don't really need to wait for it to finish. We just fire it and that's it. Let's give this a try. I'll open the developer tools using Shift-Command-C or Shift-Control-C in Windows. I'm using Firefox, by the way. I think it's the same command in Chrome. And if you're using Microsoft Edge, I think the command is Shift-Control-I. Let's switch to the Network tab and filter by AJAX request with this button. Okay, if I press the +1 button, we can see the call to the execution route. And the progress bar increments as expected. But if I fully reload the page, the execution is already there. Awesome. Now let's work on updating a habit. Open habits.view and add a new button after the progress bar. Let's give it a text color. I'll go to heroicons.com and find an edit icon I can use. This one's fine. Copy the SVG code and paste it here. Okay, this looks good. Now let's turn it into a component. Create a new file inside resources.js components and call it edit-habit-button.view. For the template, I'll just grab the button we just created and paste it here. Now go back to habits.view, import the new component, and use it after the progress bar. Everything should look the same. Similar to what we did with the execute button, whenever I click the edit button, I'll just emit an edit event. And then we'll handle the event in here with a method called habits edit habit, and then pass the current habit index. Okay, now let's open the habit store and create the new edit habit method. All I need to do here is set the form data using the current habit index, like this. And now let's expose the new method down here. Okay, let's give this a try. When I click the edit button, the dialog opens and the inputs are populated with the correct information. Perfect. But notice that the title of the dialog still says new habit. Let's change this so the title is different when we are editing a habit. Open the habit dialog component, and up here, let's replace this with a check for the habit ID. If we have one, then the title is edit habit. Otherwise, we show a title of new habit. And now the title reflects what we are trying to do. Let's use the same technique down here. If we have a habit ID, then let's use a method called habits update habit. Otherwise, we call habits store habit. Okay, back to the habits store. Let's create a new method called update habit. Let's copy and paste the code from the store habit, change the method to put, and modify the URL to include the habit ID. Add a line to clear the habit ID as well. Everything else stays the same. And don't forget to expose it down here. Okay, let's give this a try. Click the Edit button to open the dialog, change the name of this habit, and change the times per day, and then click Save. The habit is updated, and the progress bar reflects the new data as well. All that is left is to delete a habit, which at this point is very simple. Create a new file inside resources.js components called deleteHabitButton.view. Copy the contents of the Edit Habit button and paste it here. Change the event to delete. Let's grab a different icon from heroicons.com and paste it here. Import the component from habits.view and use it right next to the Edit button. On delete, we use a method called habits delete habit. Open the habit store and let's copy this update method. Call it delete habit and accept the habit index as a parameter. Set the habit ID in the form data like this. Change the request to delete and remove the form data. We only need to clear the habit ID, so remove these other lines for name and times per day. We can also remove this block for validation errors because the delete method doesn't have any. Expose the new method down here. Okay, let's give it a try. Click the trash icon and the habit is immediately removed, which is good and bad. It's good because it works, but it will be nice to have a confirmation dialog just in case we click the trash button by mistake. So let's do that now. Let's open habits.view and create a method called delete habit that accepts the habit index. Here we can check the results of the confirmation dialog with a message of, "Are you sure you want to delete this habit?" If the user confirms the action, then we call habits delete habit with the habit index. And now up here, let's call delete habit. Let's give it another try. Click the trash icon and we get a confirmation dialog. If we click cancel, nothing happens. But if we click OK, then the habit is removed. Okay, great. Now that everything is working, it's time to write the missing tests. If you try to run the tests now, you'll find that even though the tests are passing, we have a network error down here. This is because inside habits.js, in the new execution method, we are making a post request to this URL. So let's add a handler for this request. Let's go back to the setup.js file we created a while ago. This file is inside the tests folder. Here we only have one handler for the GET request. Copy it and paste it here. In the post request, we are sending a parameter with the habit ID. So, to add that parameter to this URL, we just prefix it with a colon, like this. And then we add the rest of the URL. Oh, and by the way, we don't really need the entire domain and port. We can remove it and just leave the URL like this. Since we're not returning anything from this route, let's just return an empty object. Okay, save the changes, and we need to restart the tests for these to take effect. And now we're back to green. Let's add a couple of tests for opening and closing the dialog. Let's start with opening the dialog. Let's call the openDialog method and then assert that the isDialogOpen variable is true. Okay, now for closing the dialog, copy and paste this one, call the closeDialog method, and assert that this is false. Okay, now I want to test a couple of things when editing and creating a habit. First, I want to make sure that when I edit a habit, the form data is properly set. Let's create a new test. Call the editHabit method and pass the habit index. This is set to 0 by default up here. Now, assert that the form data is the same as the habit data on that same index, like this. Okay, we are still in the green. Perfect. The next thing I want to test is that after creating a new habit, the form data is cleared out. I don't need to test that the habit is created. That's already taken care of by the backend tests. So let's create a new test. Let's set some test values in the form data. Very important, make sure this is async. Now call the storeHabit method and wait for the results. Now we have a post request that is not being handled. Let's go back to the setup file and add one more handler. I'll copy the get handler and paste it here. Since we are adding a new habit, I can just push one more entry to the mocked habits data. The ID is just the current array length plus 1, and the rest is just the request data. And executions count is 0. But looks like the body attribute is deprecated. Okay, I looked it up, and instead of using body, what we can do is define a constant equal to ID, name, and times per day, and then we call request JSON. This will give us the request body in JSON format, and we spread that into these variables. Now down here, we just use name and times per day. And it's still failing. Oh, right. Change the method to post. And also, we are not sending the habit ID in the payload, so remove it from here. Restart the tests, and we're back to green. Now, let's make sure we are properly setting the validation messages when there is an error. Create a new test. And here I'm just going to call storeHabit right away. This will send empty values in the form data. Now let's assert that both the name and times per day have error messages, like this. Since we are the ones handling the request, we have to make sure that we return the validation errors. To do this, go back to the setup file. In the post request, I'll check for the habit name and times per day. If either of those is empty, I'll return a status code of 422 with the validation errors. Let's create a mock for the validation errors, like this. Make sure the error messages are inside an array, since this is the structure returned by Laravel. Restart the tests and... that's weird.
2 hours later.
Okay, after a bit of research, I realized that this request.json call is asynchronous. So we have to add a wait here and make sure this method is async. And now when we test, it's back to green. Okay, great. Now let's do something similar when updating habits. I'm going to copy these tests and paste them here. Change the test description. Instead of setting the data directly, I can just call edit habit with the habit index. Change the method to update habit. And down here, add one line to test that the habit ID is cleared out as well. For the validation errors, again, change the test description. Call the edit habit with the habit index just to make sure the habit ID is set in the form data. Then clear out the values of name and times per day to force an error. Then change the method to update habit. As expected, now we have a put request that is not being handled. Back to the setup file, let's copy the post request and paste it here. Change the method to put and pass the habit ID in the URL. Instead of pushing a new value, I'll just update the current value with the data coming from the request. Restart the test and great, we're back to green. The final test is for deleting a habit. This one's very simple. I just want to make sure that after the habit is deleted, the habit ID is cleared out. Let's add a handler for the delete request. Copy the put request and paste it here. Remove all of this and change the request to delete. Since we are deleting a habit, let's remove it from the array like this. Restart the tests and we're back to green. And we're done. This concludes the Habit Tracker series. I really hope you found it helpful, and if you have any questions, just put them in the comments and I'll try to help as much as I can. You can find the link to the complete code in the description. Please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. It's a small thing, but it really helps. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.